Hi, everybody. This is Sam.
And this is Dillon, and welcome to the Church Chatter Podcast. Today, we'd like to talk about sacrifice. Sacrifice in terms of sacrificial offering and how we are blessed by God with certain things and then offer God these things back. Some of them in a pureness of a sacrifice, but then also some things in just like offerings. And so today we'll be talking about sacrifice.
And this is a really relevant word to unpack because this will be posted either Sunday or Monday, the week of Thanksgiving. And sacrifice has a lot to do with the concept of Thanksgiving.
Now, we want to be mindful that sacrifice in different types of Jewish traditions and Christian traditions and even many other world religions, everyone has a little bit of a different interpretation of what sacrifice means and how do we do it and where do we do it and how can we do it. But
we also want to be sensitive to the complexities of Thanksgiving in the United States of America. Of course, that is a very messy topic, and we are not romanticizing the history of our country in any way either. But there are connections.
Absolutely. So a sacrifice is a gift from God given to creation, and then God's creation, people, we offer in sacrifice these gifts that God has once given us back to God in praise and thanksgiving. That's the old traditional language for a sacrifice, giving something back to God, praise and thanksgiving. And so as we approach Thanksgiving in the United States, we've been thinking a lot about things in terms of Thanksgiving and what does Thanksgiving mean for a Christian and what does Thanksgiving mean for our nation. And technically, the holiday, Thanksgiving Day, in the United States is technically a secular holiday, except that many Christians will gather for special Thanksgiving services and special Thanksgiving meals at their churches. And so that's a very interesting thing. Although this holiday is technically secular, there is some religious undertones. And in many ways, these special services, these special Thanksgiving services and special Thanksgiving meals at churches are a type of sacrificial offering in which Christians give back to God in praise and thanksgiving. They give back to God all the goodness that God has given them throughout the year. So people come around and they talk about what they're grateful for and how God has been working in their life, and then they usually share a meal together. And these things a lot of times happen at churches. Actually, just last week, I preached at a special Thanksgiving service at one of the Lutheran churches in Jim Thorpe. And afterwards, they had a meal together. We talked about things that we were grateful for. And so, yes, although technically Thanksgiving is a secular holiday, it is also a holiday that does have some religious undertones.
If you hear a lot of noise, it's because our dog is trying to get out of the kitchen, and we are recording downstairs today because, speaking of sacrifice has a lot to do with parenthood, or parenthood has a lot to do with sacrifice. We have a 2-year-old and 3-year-old, and they both finally sleep in their own beds. So it's like 5:30 in the morning right now, so we're downstairs trying to record this before our children wake up. And our dog is in the kitchen, and we're trying to keep her quiet. So if you hear noises, that's what's going on. Okay, so sacrifice. You're going to get tired of me saying this every episode, but let's really ground this and talk about what it really meant historically. So the book of Exodus is a story about Moses rescuing people. So the book of Exodus, if you don't know, is the second book of the Hebrew Bible. Christians call it the Old Testament. It comes after Genesis. Interestingly, scholars agree that Exodus was written first. So actually the Jewish story is very rooted in the Exodus story. So it's a story about Moses rescuing people from forced labor in Egypt. They were enslaved people in Egypt. By the way, my favorite hymn or spiritual song is Go Down Moses. So if you haven't heard it, go listen to it. I love the book of Exodus. And it's all about Moses liberating people from Egypt, liberating the Hebrew people, the Israelites, the Jewish people. So Exodus, Ex means out of, and Hodos, which is where we get the end of Exodus, means road or way. So Exodus literally means the way out of or the road out of, right? So Exodus is all about the Israelites and their way out of slavery. After the book of Exodus comes the book of Leviticus. So this comes next, and this is about arranging new liberated life in the wilderness for 40 years before they arrive to the promised land, what is today Jerusalem and surrounding areas. Excuse me. So for 40 years, the story goes, Israelites were essentially camping in the wilderness together. A little side note here that I think is really important is 40. The number 40 is a symbol for a journey. So we have no way of knowing how long they wandered in the wilderness, and that actually doesn't really matter. Likely it wasn't a literal 40 years, right? 40, we see it over and over again in ancient religious texts. Moses spent 40 days on Mount Sinai. Jesus fasted alone in the desert for 40 days. Buddha meditated under a tree for 40 days. Our word quarantine even comes from the word 40. So it's a symbolic number for a period of healing or transformation. So to say that the Hebrew people were in the desert wandering for 40 years, it's not a way to tell us literally how long it lasted. We have no way of knowing that. It could have been a week. It could have been 40 years. It could have been months. We have no way of knowing, right? It's not a way to tell us how literally long it lasted. It's a symbolic way to say that their community was undergoing a transformation. That's what that 40 years means. So let's just start there. They were in the desert. They were wandering, right? They were newly liberated people. For generations, they were enslaved. So these people, their parents were enslaved. Their grandparents were enslaved. They don't know a life without enslavement. They are now liberated. And liberation without structure is just chaos. So I'm going to say that again. Liberation or freedom without structure is just chaos. Infants cannot survive or thrive without somebody who loves them, giving structure to their lives. We often like to lift up Darwin's writings around survival of the fittest, but he also talks a lot about love. And I've actually heard it said that we should also be talking about survival of the nurtured, right? If you are not nurtured as a child, then you do not grow up to be a thriving adult. Nurturing is not just about hugging and feeding and loving. It's also about structure, right? Dylan and I have a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old. Because we love them, they have bedtimes. They don't like bedtime, but they have a bedtime. They go to bed around the same time every day. They have a meal schedule. They have rules to keep them safe, right? This is love. This is what freedom looks like, is structure. This is what safety looks like, is structure. Of course, and we'll talk about this, too much structure can be a problem. We'll talk about that later. But we also see this with people who are new in recovery from any kind of addiction. One of the first things an addict in recovery needs is structure, a schedule and rules about what they can and cannot do until they get back on their feet. I know a lot of addicts in long-term recovery, and they have a very early bedtime. That's a rule in their life. They know that if they stay up late, this will be a trigger that will get them into trouble, right? Nothing good happens for them at nighttime. So they need the structure of an early bedtime to keep them safe, because in their new liberated life, they are liberated in a lot of ways from their former addiction. They need this rule, this structure in their life. Liberation without rules and structure. Again, there's a balance, but it's not really liberation, it's chaos. By the way, this is why some people can become so legalistic about religion. They were harmed in some way, they were traumatized or felt unsafe for some reason, so they cling to the structure and the rules and the black and white of it all. This is often the first step in liberation and maturity. And of course, like I said, we can't stay in this season of rigidity. Long-term rigidity is actually a sign of psychological and spiritual unhealth. Flexibility, I think a lot of therapists and psychologists would say this, flexibility is a trait that is a sign of psychologically and spiritually healthy people. So to become flexible and to begin to see the complexities and the nuances and even the contradictions of religion and in all of it is actually a sign of psychological, emotional, and spiritual maturity. This is true for kids too. So like I said, Dylan and I have a 2 and a 3-year-old. We give them black and white rules, right? Right now at their age, it's all pretty black and white. Our 3-year-old, she's almost 4. She's starting to see some nuance in some of it. But as they get older and they continue to mature and become healthy kids, teenagers, adults, they're going to begin to see and experience a flexibility in these rules. There's context around rules. Sometimes the rules apply, other times they don't. This flexibility is a sign that they are growing into healthy, mature, even liberated people. If they got older and they still cling to hard and fast rules, this black and white thinking, that's actually a symptom of unhealth and a sense of unsafety. So again, if you have people in your life, or maybe you are this person, and you have this sense of like, nope, this is what the Bible says and it's always this way, right? That rigidity is keeping someone safe, right? And that's okay. So be patient and give grace to the people in your life who see the world in black and white and think these rules are rigid and they need to apply to everybody in the same exact way and that everybody's on the same exact path. If they treat religion in this rigid way, there's likely a sense of unsafety about something inside of them. And this desire to have something rigid to grasp to is the first step towards a liberated life. We all start there as children, right? We start with these black and white rules. Again, we can't get stuck in the season of rigidity. We have to eventually move beyond it. Do you agree, Dylan?
I very much agree.
Yeah. So the Israelites were in the infancy of their liberated lives. They were like children who needed black and white rules. They were like an addict new in recovery who needed these black and white rules. They needed to organize their life somehow. They needed to put kind of guides into their life. So the Israelites in the desert needed structure and rules for this season of transformation in their life. Transformation often has to do with new rules and new way of seeing things. So the newly liberated people wander in the desert. They didn't know structure without enslavement. The only structure in their life was from the Egyptian enslavers. Their liberated lives needed a new set of rules. And this is what the 10 Commandments was about, right? It was a way to give their life structure, some rules, because they were wreaking havoc on each other. There was violence, right? So they needed these rules, which is why we get the story of Moses going up to Mount Sinai for 40 days. Again, that number 40, right? He was on a journey as well. That's what that 40 symbol means. This is what Leviticus, the book of Leviticus, which is one of the most hated, and at face value, one of the most boring books of the Bible.
I love it.
I do too. Once you
it.
know more about it, which I'm going to explain in a minute, it's so interesting, but it's just, Leviticus is named after the Levi tribe, the Levites.
The
Levites. You'll find that I never know how to pronounce words because I read a lot. Dylan talks a lot about this stuff. I read a lot about it. So when I say it out loud, I realize, I don't even know what this sounds like out loud. I just read it all the time. So the Levites were essentially the priests, right? So they were the rulers, the priests of the group. So this is a lot of priestly rules. So remember, these people were just enslaved in Egypt. So they witnessed power, Egyptian power, as a hierarchy. This is what they knew. So very quickly in Leviticus, we see a hierarchy of people emerge. So Leviticus chapter 4, verse 3 states that if an anointed priest sins, he must offer a bull. Leviticus chapter 4, 22 through 28 says that when a ruler sins, so not a priest, but like a notch below a priest, a ruler sins, he must offer a male goat. And then whenever any of the ordinary people sin, they must offer a female goat. So we're kind of seeing this hierarchy, right? First, it's a priest who offers a bull, which is like a big kind of inaccessible animal in the desert. And a ruler who's a little less than a priest can offer a male goat. And then a female goat, which is seen as a little less than. A male goat is just for the ordinary people. So we're seeing this hierarchy of people and what they have access to offer for their sins. Leviticus chapter 4, verse 32 says that a sheep offering is also acceptable. So a sheep is even more accessible than a bull or a male or female goat. But then it goes on. Chapter 5, verse 7 says, but if you cannot afford a sheep, again, these people were just liberated. They don't have like an intense economic system or political system, but you're seeing this hierarchy already begin to take place between the haves and the have-nots. So Leviticus 5, chapter 5, verse 7 says, but if you cannot afford a sheep, you shall bring to the Lord 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons. These were very common birds. Verse 11 goes on to say, even more than this to really make the point, but if you cannot afford 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, you shall bring 1/10 of and I'm going to say this wrong, an ephah, which is a measurement, it's a form of measurement, of choice flour. You shall not put oil on it or lay frankincense on it. So this is a hierarchy of offerings. This is evidence, right, that there's people who have things and there's people who don't. There's people who are seen as better than and there are people who are seen as less than. Right away, they're freed from slavery and they already have these hierarchies. And these people, we see this rank taking form But then we see this is a new kind of God, right? So this is what's interesting about the book of Leviticus that can be missed, is that we have a new kind of God here. We don't have a God that only accepts the best offerings of bulls and goats. We have a God who even includes those who can only offer flour, which is something everybody had. And the Bible even shows us that not even the fancy flour with the oil or the frankincense, but just plain old flour, something anybody had access to. So if you don't understand the hierarchy of this in the book of Leviticus, you miss the grace of it. This is a new kind of God for these people who are just liberated, who sees even the lowliest within the community. This is a big deal. In the ancient Near East, this kind of God was unheard of. This was a God of even the oppressed. So if the idea of offering animals as a sacrifice is troubling to us, you probably hear our dog again. So if the idea of offering animals as a sacrifice is difficult for you, let's put this in context. First of all, yes. Yeah, of course. It's brutal, right? We're killing animals at the altar for God. But if we are upset about ancient people slaughtering animals at the altar for God, we should be at least as equally as angry about the slaughtering of animals that is happening today. Millions and millions of animals are killed in our culture every day in the name of industrial farming. The difference is, back then, they were eating their offered animals too. They were simply inviting God into the meal first. So if somebody sinned, they had to make an offering, and Leviticus is telling you what you have to offer. So you would have to make an offering and share a meal with the community. So if I was a priest and I sinned, I'd have to go get a bull because I'm a priest. I have access to a bull. I would have to take it to God in whatever space is designated, right? So now it's in churches, or temples or whatever it is. You would take the bull, offer it to God, kill it, but then that act is seen as publicly, it's essentially confession, right? You're confessing, I have sinned and I am aware of it. And you're apologizing in this very ritualistic way to your community. The bull is there being slaughtered and offered to God. It's being sacrificed, yes. But then you're feeding your community with that bull. You're sharing a meal, right? So this is a sort of public confession. If you are a Christian, you can probably hear the echoes of communion or the Eucharist here. We confess our sins communally, and then we have a meal together. Then we have the bread and wine, the communion. Hopefully your ears are ringing, right? There should be some echoes there. So the Hebrew people made an offering or a sacrifice to God, and then they ate their offering in community. And we do the same thing today. Only we are much more cruel to our animals before we kill them, and we do not invite God into the meal the way the Hebrew people were. Did I explain that in a way that's clear?
That was very good.
So let's talk about the reason this offering or this sacrifice was made. Sacrifice comes from the words sacrum, meaning sacred, and facere, again, I think I'm saying that right, meaning to make. So literally sacrifice means to make something sacred, which is often done by offering it to God. So to make food sacred in ancient times was vital, considering food was not as readily available as it is today in much of the world. To sacrifice an animal or to make it sacred, to sacrifice an animal to God before eating it, again, which is not any different than what we do today. We sacrifice animals so we can eat them. We just don't invite God into the process. So to sacrifice an animal to God before eating it was to make it sacred and ready for consumption. So a really important factor here, if we can just shift our posture towards this conversation, religion is not a part of human history. Religion is human history. So to the ancient Hebrew people, to invite God into every aspect of common life, like a meal, this was not an add-on, right? This wasn't like an extra thing. This was an integrated part of their life. Religious practices like making a sacrifice to God before eating the sacrifice was not a part of their life. It was their life, right? So
real quick, just to add here, a common practice that can be seen in the modern day in terms of offering and praise to God in a sacrifice is when someone says a prayer at mealtime,
right?
Or someone says, sometimes they'll say, "Can we say grace?" And they pray before the mealtime, even if it's chicken nuggets and French fries, which is kind of crazy. But what God has given in potatoes and chicken, we give thanks to God back. And this is This is, again, really in the modern times, seen especially at holidays and in mealtime, kind of the sacrificial
Yeah.
praise back to God for what God has given
Yeah, that's good.
in a meal.
Yeah. And again, just to kind of wrap that up, imagine there's these people who for generations are in Egypt, they're enslaved. Moses comes, frees them, leads them out of Egypt. And it's just, I don't know how many people, thousands of people
Yep.
who are walking in the desert. They don't have a home. They don't have a society. They don't have rules. They don't have regulations. They kind of have this Hebrew identity and like Jewish religion kind of taking form. But again, they didn't have a temple in Egypt, right? They didn't have, they had their community. So I do wonder,
Well, no, when they were wandering, they had the Ark of the Covenant.
Right, when they were wandering. But before this, they didn't have any of this. So they had to kind of create structure, a new kind of structure. I'm sure they had some things in their enslaved community. But that's something I would have to read more about. I'm not sure. Maybe that'll be a future episode. But so they're wandering in and do you have something to say?
No.
Okay. So they were wandering in the desert. They were killing each other for a little while. They were harming each other. There was violence. They were fighting over who has things, who doesn't have things. They were hoarding food, right? So Moses got the 10 Commandments, brought them down for these people and saying, these are the new rules from God. Because if God wasn't part of those rules, if those rules didn't come from God, these people wouldn't have cared because, again, God was foundational for them. They didn't want some man-made rules. They needed a God to guide them because religion is human history. So they got these 10 Commandments in the book of Exodus, and then Leviticus gives these rules about saying, okay, if you sin, if you break these rules, here's what you have to do. You have to bring an offering, a sacrifice. You have to sacrifice because you have to publicly tell everybody, I know what I did was wrong. I sinned. I'm sorry, right? The community can forgive you. Again, if you attend a liturgical church, this is part of it. First, we confess our sins communally. We are forgiven. The pastor says that we are forgiven, right? And then we have, you can also do this individually, especially if you're Catholic, right? There's a confession kind of process. But then we have a meal together. So they would bring their sacrifice. It would be killed. If it was flour, it was often turned into bread or something like that. And then it was eaten as a community. Does that sum it up well?
Yep. Very
Okay.
good.
So here's why we say all of this. Pay special attention to the fact that sacrifice, the word sacrifice here historically, is not rooted in the idea, the way that we use it today, that like, I sacrificed something for you, like I gave something up for you. Sacrifice has everything to do with being made sacred. So it's not rooted in the idea that one must suffer or that someone is substituting their life or suffering for another's. This understanding of sacrifice has led to a theological understanding of Jesus having to die as a sacrifice in place of humanity having to suffer or die. And this, to me, is missing the actual point.
And real quick, also, sacrifice not only is taking something and blessing it and making it sacred, setting it apart to make it sacred, and giving what God has already given us back to God. But sacrifice is whether we're talking about in the Jewish tradition, in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, or if we're talking about what Samantha's going to talk about a little bit more, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But the idea is that sacrifice is being made whole. You're being made whole. You're understanding the gifts of God, and you're being made whole.
Linguistically, we're tapping into something here where if sacrifice means to be made sacred, sacred and holy can be seen as synonyms, and holy has everything to do with being made whole. So to make something sacred is to be made whole. A way that we can kind of put it in our modern language is if somebody is physically healthy and maybe emotionally and psychologically healthy, there's also a spiritual component to living. And that doesn't always mean religious, but like there's a spiritual component to living. And if you're not spiritual in any way, then you're not made whole is the idea. And that's not to place judgment on anybody saying everybody needs religion. That is not at all what I'm saying, but I am saying that like that's the idea. Is spirituality is this wholeness. The concept of God for the Hebrew people was this, like, you are not whole if you are not in good relationship or standing. I'm not sure how you want to word that because it was all evolving, but yeah, that was good. Okay, so the word sacrifice, it's not about replacing your suffering with someone else's suffering, right? The point of a sacrifice, even as it pertains to Jesus being killed on the cross, is that a sacrifice is making something common, sacred, by inviting God into it. And that might offend you, me saying that Jesus' crucifixion was common, but common doesn't mean it wasn't special. It just means that it was not unique. Jesus was not the first Jew killed for treason. He was not the first Jew to, not by a long shot actually, there were many. He was not the only Jew to claim the Messiah identity, which contributed to these treason charges. And if you listen to our episode about the word Christ, you understand why the Roman Empire did not like Jews running around talking about being the Messiah or the Christ. Jesus was a sacrifice, but that does not mean that he had to suffer so the rest of humanity didn't. He didn't suffer in our place. He didn't take our place. Instead, referring to him as a sacrifice can be seen as his death being made sacred the same way these meals were being made sacred for the Hebrew people. Jesus' death was seen as sacred because God was invited into it. Just like the Hebrew wandering the desert and inviting God into their every meal by making an offering of animals or flour, the God of the Hebrew people was invited into Jesus' death too. And remember, this is a God of the oppressed. This is a God who accepts those who only have plain and common flour to offer. And this is a God who, as Christians believe, is fully aligned with Jesus of Nazareth, a poor, a lowly tradesperson who was engaged in a movement against the oppressive powers of the Roman Empire. So that kind of leads us into this thing called atonement theories. Can you tell us, before you get into it, make sure you define what is an atonement theory? I described one, and clearly the one that I align with, but what is an atonement theory?
Well, before we get to atonement theories,
Okay.
we need to talk about some other things very quickly. So, on the 28th of November this year, the United States will celebrate Thanksgiving Day. And Thanksgiving Day is a wonderful and beautiful tradition where people will get together and they'll sit around tables and they'll have turkeys and stuffing and green bean casserole and sweet potatoes and all these wonderful things. And they'll share what they're grateful for, and probably people will have lots of good and fun wine and all kinds of things. But also there'll be a little bit of struggle and tension, because when you get a lot of groups of people together, sometimes there can be a little bit of conflict. And so Thanksgiving is both a wonderful and beautiful tradition, but it's also sometimes a little bit of a struggle. And especially in the American context, in the context of the United States, we need to be mindful that Thanksgiving Day, the Thanksgiving holiday, has been caught up since the colonial times with brushing aside indigenous tribes and peoples of the Americas, and kind of rooting out all of which they stood for. And that's something that we need to grapple with. And so we can't just say, oh, it's Thanksgiving Day and it's wonderful. Yes, and many people's customs and traditions have been pushed aside, which we need to reflect on. So this takes me to, in this season of the autumn of the year, the leaves are falling. Most of them are off now because we're in the month of November.
If you're in our part of the country.
If you're in our part of the country on the East Coast. But one of the things that's very interesting is all religions, most religions, world religions, have all had festival days or feast days or holidays in which they give thanks to God, or if they're polytheistic, the gods, for the harvest for Thanksgiving.
And another side note, because I love side notes, is holidays means holy days. So if you or anybody you know gets upset about somebody saying happy holidays, it literally means happy holy days, which is not taking God out of the season. It's very much opening it up for anybody who sees God from any spiritual path.
Yes,
Okay,
and I think that's a beautiful thing. On this podcast, we mostly talk about the Jewish and Christian traditions. Sometimes we'll talk about others, but we primarily talk about those two. The Jewish religion has always had a deep connection to the earth, and Israelites who evolved into the Jewish tradition have always given special attention to special days of praise and thanksgiving to God for the harvest and for other things. And there's this passage in Psalm 50, verses 14 through 15, that says, "Sacrifice thanks offerings to God. Fulfill your vows to the Most High. and call on me in the day of trouble. I will deliver you, and you will honor me. In the ancient Israelite and evolving Hebrew traditions, there has been, since the very beginning, different types of offerings. And many scholars have looked at them, and there's small little offerings here and there, but mostly there is 5 different offerings.
And when we say offering, that it also means sacrifice.
Yeah, offering and sacrifice are together. They're a parallel in many ways. And so in the ancient Hebrew, in the ancient Israelite, in the ancient Jewish tradition, there was 5 different sacrifices, 5 different offerings. There was a burnt offering, there was a grain offering, a peace offering, a sin offering, and a trespass offering. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty detail of what made them what, but for instance, Samantha talked about the priest giving a whole bull. That bull was burnt. That was a burnt offering. Samantha talks about the person who is struggling with food insecurity, is impoverished, and that person can perhaps only give the meal or the flour, and that person would then offer a grain offering.
So really quick, a question. I would have thought that all of the offerings or sacrifices that I talked about were sin offerings because they were being told to do it if they sinned.
No.
Is that something different?
Yeah, something different. So sin means that you broke a commandment, and when you broke a commandment, you then offered God a sacrificial offering to atone for that sin. But also,
is that not what's being talked about in Leviticus when it says, like if a ruler sins, he must offer a male goat? So it can be seen as a sin offering.
So a sin offering can also be a burnt offering. Okay. It could also be a grain offering. But you'll see at the harvest there is also grain offerings. Just because God has given us that grain, we give a portion of that grain back, and I'll talk about that. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay, very good. So there's those 5 traditional types of offerings in the ancient Jewish.
Well, quick question. You said peace offering. Is that like we pass the peace at church? Is that?
Yes. The idea is that you go before God and you are at peace with God and neighbor, and so you come and you say, I have conflict, I have dispute with this person, I have anger towards God, and how do I remedy that in a sacrificial offering? You go and you talk to God through prayer. Or you go into the community and you have the sacrificial offering of peace, so that you are not in conflict when you go to be with others or be with God, in this case, in the temple.
Again, the word sacrifice, we're seeing it like to make it sacred. So a peace offering is not just shaking your neighbor's hand saying hi, it's bringing God into it and saying, hey, we're good, right? We're at peace. And I know that there's some Amish communities that if everybody's not in peace with each other, this peace offering, they won't take communion that day until the peace is resolved, which is really interesting.
That is very interesting. And it's also important that when we talk about sacrifice or sacrificial offerings, it is important to say we are taking something very ordinary that God has given us, and God is, through blessing, making it extraordinary. It's setting it apart. It's taking something and setting it apart, a portion out, okay? It's important to note that modern-day Jews of all different traditions, whether Orthodox, Conservative, Reformed, or Reconstructionist, that modern-day Jews do not participate in animal offerings and sacrifices in the modern day. So that is no longer happening. Many Jewish festival days originated, and when I say festival days, it's a type of special holiday. So when I say a festival, it's a type of special holiday. So many Jewish festival days originated with the seasons and the cycles of the earth, and 2 in particular in the Jewish tradition, which are still a part of the Jewish tradition in all traditions and denominations of Judaism. They celebrate the harvest. And the first one is the Festival of Ingathering, it's called, and it's sometimes known as the Festival of Booths or the Festival of Tabernacles. And this festival or holiday is celebrated in the autumn of the year, usually in late September or the month of October. And it celebrates the harvest yield, meaning what the yield that we got from the harvest at the end of the year. And this harvest festival is spoken of primarily in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, but there are some references in the Hebrew scriptures, other places. But the three passages, or the passages in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy call upon Jews to bring a portion of their harvest to their temple. They are to place their portion of the harvest in a basket and give it to the rabbi. Some more ancient texts will say give it to the priest. Now there is no priests in Judaism, so it would be the rabbi. So you give it to the rabbi, and the rabbi then places the basket of the harvest near the altar or near a central table in the synagogue or the temple. And this is very interesting because this is in the autumn of the year, Jews will come together for the festival of ingathering, or the festival of booths or tabernacles, and they'll give a portion of the harvest back to God because God gave that harvest to them in the very beginning. Many Christian denominations, including the Lutheran Church, as you know by now, I'm a Lutheran pastor, and many Christian churches and denominations continue celebrating this harvest festival, but in slightly new ways. And so many Christians have seen the festival of ingathering, and they have honed in on that.
And did you say this? I'm assuming that this food was given to people who needed it?
No, actually, it was given mostly to, in ancient times, it was given mostly to feed the priests and those who were serving at the temple. Some of it would go into the granary to be stored for the winter when they would need it. Nowadays, many synagogues and temples, Jewish synagogues and temples, will take that food and they will give it to a local food pantry or something like that.
Why was it given to the priest? Was that seen as problematic?
Did they need it? No, not necessarily problematic, but that was a portion because the priest was seen as a godly figure, and so you were giving it to a godly figure, and that figure was giving it to God, and there's kind of a chain of command. Now, those things in modern Judaism are no longer. I'm talking about ancient.
Right. Well, this is also a time when the emperor was seen as the son of God as well. So I can see how to give offerings to what we would call now a rabbi, but the priest was also a social statement of like, no, I'm not going to give willingly to the emperor. I'm going to give to the
Well, right, and you were giving your best harvest yield so that the priest would be able to eat because the priest represents God in many ways as an intermediary. Okay. So out of this Jewish festival of ingathering, celebrating the harvest of the year, like I said, many Christian denominations, including the Lutheran Church, celebrate a similar festival. And the reason behind this practice is that Jesus is recorded. This is why Christians celebrate this harvest festival, many Christians, I should say. Because Jesus is recorded in the Gospel of St. John to have attended this harvest festival of ingathering in Jerusalem and found it to be important. So in the Gospel of John, in the Gospel of St. John, we see that Jesus travels to the temple in Jerusalem, and he goes there and he spends time, he finds it important to go to the harvest festival of ingathering. And so most Christian denominations see that as specific as, well, if Jesus found this festival to be important and he went to it, perhaps we should follow suit, just with some little tweaks here and there.
Is this when he flipped a table in Jerusalem?
No.
Okay.
No. So, and most Christians call this festival Harvest Home. Okay, it's called Harvest Home Sunday. Okay, and this festival gives thanks to God for the harvest yield, and many Christians will collect food during this time for those in need, and these Harvest Home festivals focus on offering praise and thanksgiving back to God by collecting food for the hungry and unhoused, which is then given to those in need in the Christian communities. Whether that's families in the congregation that need it or families outside of the congregation in the general community, that food that is offered to God during the Harvest Home Festival, is then given back to the people in need.
It's interesting, too. You can see kind of theologically, like if you listen to our Protestant episode, you can see how the Protestant Reformation kind of led to this questioning of power and authority and how close are the religious clergy to God compared to the rest of us. So you can see that shift. I don't know when it took place, but it did take place somewhere in history, that we used to give this offering or this sacrifice to the priests of the temple, but now, at least in Christianity, we give it to the people in need. There's this shift of like, well, maybe the priests and pastors aren't like a direct line to God like we used to
Correct.
think. Because
Absolutely.
the Protestant Reformation led to this questioning of authority and power.
Except that it's interesting that these Christian Harvest Home festivals that come out of the Jewish festival of ingathering, or the festival of booths or tabernacles, it's interesting that many Christian churches, for their Harvest Home festivals, including my own congregation, they still will bring the canned goods and other types of non-perishable items, and they will decorate with them and bring them up front to the altar, and somewhere in and around there will be a basket, which is interesting. So they still keep with this kind of bringing it to the altar, not necessarily to the priest, and they keep with the basket, that it's all wrapped around in this basket.
That is interesting.
Okay, so the interesting thing in terms of this season of Thanksgiving and the harvest, the idea is that God gives the harvest, we offer some back to God, and then we give what we offered to God to those in need as a blessing from God to the community. So the festivals or holy days or holidays that we have been talking about, the festival of ingathering, the festivals of Harvest Home, these are things that happen in the autumn of the year, in the fall. But the Jewish tradition also celebrates a spring harvest festival known as the Festival of First Fruits, or sometimes known as the Festival of Weeks. And this harvest festival is celebrated in the spring of the year, either in May or June. And this festival, or this holy day, has historic connection to the harvest of wheat for the making of bread. So bread was seen as very much a staple of that community. And so when the harvest would come in for the wheat in the spring of the year for the baking of bread and other things, the Jewish tradition still to this day keeps this festival of first fruits in the spring. So as we celebrate Thanksgiving this time of year, whether you're a Christian or not a Christian, once again, Thanksgiving Day in the United States is technically a secular holiday, and it also, once again, has these religious undertones. As Christians from the very beginning have been giving thanks to God, Jews have been giving thanks to God in certain seasons of the year. For God's goodness throughout the year, we give thanks back to God as a sacrifice and an offering. So, do you want? So I've given some detail on that. Do you want me to go right into
Atonement theories?
Atonement theories, but also, do we want to talk about certain connections? Okay, so just very briefly, there are connections in the Christian life in which you can very much see a sacrificial offering, right? You see this in, I'm not going to go into detail here, but in the Christian life, baptism, whether it is an infant child or adult, is seen as some type of sacrificial offering and goodness. Water comes from God. The water is then blessed. The person is then baptized.
Again, remember, sacrifice isn't about suffering.
Right.
Sacrifice is about being made sacred because you're inviting God into it.
So
into this common thing that has to do with water and oil.
Right. So those who are baptized with water and anointed with oil.
And again, we have an episode on baptism, so I think you're probably starting to see how all these things are intertwined and they're connected.
These are things that set a person apart, to place them in a community and bless them, but also to make them new, wholeness, new sacrifice. So we see this in the sacrament of baptism in the Christian tradition. And then communion, or the Eucharist, and Eucharist means in Greek thanksgiving. It literally means thanksgiving. And so we see this: God gives us the bread and wine. We bless that bread and wine. We receive that bread and wine, and from that we give back to God that. So we see that.
Yeah. Dylan obviously went to seminary because he's a pastor, but I also take seminary classes just because that's my idea of a good time. And we had a he was a pastor, but a professor. He hates the word Eucharist because it's about giving thanks, and theologically he believes that communion is about receiving grace, not about giving anything, and that you don't have to give anything. We'll do a whole episode on the word Eucharist because there's a lot there to unpack. People have opinions about the word Eucharist and communion,
and not to get in the weeds here, but it's interesting because some Christian denominations do not believe that God that God gives God's grace. This is getting very theological, so I'm not going to get in the weeds, but some Christian denominations do not believe that God's grace comes in the waters of baptism, in the bread and wine of Holy Communion. They just believe that it's bread and wine and it's just plain water. So God's grace is not present there. For Lutherans,
and again, wait, I just need to really make this clear. The reason this has to do with sacrifice is about being made sacred because you're inviting God into it. So communion is made sacred because God is being invited into it.
Right, and baptismal water and bread and wine that are in communion, those things, yes, were once ordinary, but when they are blessed, they are no longer just ordinary, they become extraordinary. So there's
just like the bull, the goat, the flour without frankincense or oil, just like Jesus' death, people died, people were hung constantly in the Roman Empire. It was a common occurrence. It was made sacred. It was seen as a sacrifice because God was invited into it. It was made sacred.
Yeah, absolutely.
All connected to sacrifice.
Right. So we see sacrifice and offering in baptism. We see it in the Eucharist or communion. We also see it in many liturgical churches. Will have altar flowers or chancel flowers. These are flowers that are given. Usually on a Sunday or other special holy days by people in the congregation or people from the community, and they are placed near the altar or in the chancel, which is the area around the altar.
And so I want to do a really quick, really important side note. I know I interrupted you, but
no, that's right.
You said liturgical churches. So the reason that we wanted to do this podcast, especially me, is I didn't go to church for the first time until I was 28, and the language of church stuff it used to be so overwhelming to me because people would just drop these words like sacrifice and Christ as if it had meaning, but it didn't for me. I'm like, I don't know what the hell you all are talking about. I am very confused, and it was frustrating for me. I felt like I was an observer more than a participant, so I just fell down this rabbit hole, and I'm still falling down it. So whenever we say liturgical church, we're going to have an episode that might even be the next one, I'm not sure, to tell you what liturgical means, what liturgy means. So if there's ever any words that we drop, we're going to try to define them. But liturgy is a very difficult word to describe very quickly. So we might have a whole episode on it to really ground it and let you know what it means. That's the whole point of this podcast. So if there's ever a word that you don't know, go follow us on Instagram at church_chatter_podcast and comment or DM us and tell us what word you want us to cover because we can go there. Because religious language is very difficult, and that's what this podcast is about.
Right, and Samantha really helps me with that because sometimes, as a formally trained person and pastor, I'll just throw these words out, and Samantha always brings me back, which is so good. I deeply need that.
Well, you spend time with pastors, so you all can just throw these words around.
Absolutely.
And the pastors that you spend time with are more progressive, mainline pastors like you. So whenever you all use these words like sacrifice, you know what they mean and
Absolutely.
They know what you mean. But the common person doesn't know the history of that.
No, and that is the whole purpose of this podcast, to break down language and wording and phrasing and all these things and to make it accessible for everyone. So if you've never seen flowers, in a church before. Flowers can, in many churches, can be given by members of the church or community people, and they can be offered in a sacrificial way in praise and thanksgiving to God for us to remember someone who has died or to remember a special event in someone's life, right? And so followers of Jesus, Christians, will set aside special things in a person's life. Maybe that's an wedding anniversary. Maybe that's a birthday. Maybe a child is being baptized, or maybe we're remembering a loved one. And we will do that. We will offer flowers near the altar, and that is a type of sacrifice. And then the other one is martyrdom, and I'm not going to go into martyrdom too much because that is going to go into the atonement theory stuff. But martyrdom in the Christian tradition and in some other world religions, but martyrdom is seen as a person who is either killed, imprisoned, tortured, or questioned for a cause, right? And Jesus was a type of martyr because he was put to death for a cause. So martyrdom, and he was not the only one. Many Christians after him also went to their martyrdom. They were killed, imprisoned, tortured, or questioned for a cause. That cause was following Jesus. So martyrdom is one of them.
And martyrdom has really taken off with Christianity, and you can even see it in a lot of Christians now. Christians often think that being a martyr is the point of being a Christian, just being selfless and giving oneself. It really took root in Christianity in a lot of complex ways.
Yes, and that is also not the full story.
No, it is not.
The Christians and the Christian tradition should not be going around having a martyr complex that we're being persecuted, especially in the United States. Yes, there are issues and there are concerns, but when I talk about ancient martyrdom, the martyrdom of Jesus or the martyrdom of some of the early saints of the church, that is something totally different. That is not talking about modern day, I'm being persecuted or whatever. And I'm not dismissing that. I'm not dismissing that at all. But those are two totally different things. And so we could also have a podcast about that if we want and talk about it, because that's also very important. So I'm going to move into, do you want me to move into the...
Yeah, that was all really helpful. So remember where I left off was talking about how sacrifice has to do not with Jesus dying in place of humanity's suffering, right? He didn't die so that humans would be saved. Sacrifice had to do with his death being common and being made sacred because God was invited into it, because Jesus was aligned fully with God, right? God was fully indwelling. It's the whole concept of the Trinity. Jesus was fully God. God was fully Jesus in that moment. So that's one atonement theory. Can you tell us what atonement means?
Yes, atonement, the word atonement is the ato and then mant, or the mint, and meaning that that one is put in the place of something else. One is put in the place of something else to take on something for the whole community, right? So it's one person taking on something for the whole community. It's an atonement. It's a type of sacrificial offering in many ways.
And again, that definition kind of like contradicts what I just said. So again, if we can hold these contradictions and just move forward, there's a lot of ways. Essentially, atonement theory is what happened on the cross.
No, yeah, yes, and it didn't take a... Wait till you hear what I say.
Right,
it
that's
did
what
not,
I'm saying.
Yeah.
It seems to contradict, but it gets more nuanced, so we're going to get there.
Yes.
But essentially, I just want to really simplify it, and again, I'm going to say this a lot. I'm going to really ground it. So atonement theories are just theories about what happened on the cross. What is the meaning of Jesus dying on the cross, right? To put it really simply?
Yes, but also it's not just about the cross either, as you'll see. That the cross is one part of a greater story. So historically, in the Christian tradition, when I was in seminary, I had to take many courses on church doctrine and teaching, and that is sometimes called systematic theology. I had to spend a lot of time on what do we believe in terms of doctrine. So when we talk about atonement theologies or atonement theories, we're talking about church doctrine, right? And I would like to let everyone know, just before we start this, there has never been one sole consensus on which atonement theory to apply, which atonement theory is this or that. There have always been different, multiple understandings of what does Jesus' life, death, and resurrection mean. So, as I move forward with these and we close out then after that, do not think that, oh, well, I only have to believe this because this is what it is. No, there has always been a plethora of understanding. There still is. And historically, there have been 5 understandings of atonement theory in terms of the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Excuse me. Yes. The first one, and one of the most earliest ones, one of the most ancient ones in the Christian traditions, the atonement theory, it's called moral influence theory. And this is one of the earliest theories for the atonement. And the moral influence theory simply teaches that Jesus Christ came and died in order to bring about a positive change to humanity. And this moral change comes from the teachings of Jesus alongside his example and his actions in the world. And the most notable name here is that St. Augustine from the 4th century was influential in spreading this moral influence theory, right? And this idea, especially in the Western Christian church. Excuse me. And the moral influence theory of atonement states that Jesus was crucified as a martyr due to his radical nature and moral teachings and example. And so in many ways, the moral influence theory of atonement emphasizes that Jesus Christ was a teacher, he was a healer, and he was a founder and leader of a movement. And ultimately, as a result, as he called for change and different moral teachings, he became the first martyr of the Christian movement, of the followers of Jesus. So this actually doesn't have to do with just Jesus's crucifixion at all. It has to do with Jesus's life, Jesus's moral teachings, Jesus's idea that he wants to transform humanity and make something new. And for that, he died and then rose and became something new. And that resurrection story now lives with those who follow his moral and ethical teachings. But he died for that because he really was pushing the envelope. He called for something new.
I think for me, I like to say not that he died, but he was killed. I think that's especially important for that theory. He was killed.
And he was killed at the hands of the empire. And so that is the moral influence theory. And I hate to say it, I would love to tell you my own personal favorite, but I don't know if I should say that here. Maybe I will at the very end.
This goes without saying, we have not named our employers for a reason on this podcast. We're not speaking on behalf of employers.
That's true.
Dylan has said that he's part of the Lutheran Church, but he fully aligns with the teachings of the Lutheran Church, ELCA, so he can speak on behalf of ELCA. I think we are not doing that, but we're not speaking on behalf of any employers, so I think that you can say your favorite.
So I'll tell you it at the end after we get through here. So that is the moral influence theory of atonement. The second one is the ransom theory, and the ransom theory of atonement is one of the first major theories of atonement, and it often is held alongside moral influence theory. And usually it deals with the actual death of Jesus. So when we're looking at the ransom theory of atonement, we're specifically looking at the death of Jesus. And what we actually will look at is in Jesus's death, that is where we see this atonement for humanity, right? So this theory finds its roots in the early Christian church, particularly in the writings of Origen, and Origen was one of the early Christian writings. This was about the 3rd century. And this theory of the ransom theory essentially teaches that Jesus Christ died as a ransom sacrifice to pay either to Satan, listen to this one, it's interesting, pays it either to Satan, which was the dominant version, I even have that in my notes, it was the dominant version, or it was a ransom to God the Father. So Jesus' death then became an act of payment to satisfy the debt on behalf of the souls of humanity. And that payment either had to be given to Satan, which was the original thing, or given to God, because humanity was so depraved and so disgusting that something needed to be paid back to either Satan or God, so that we could correct all these things. And this is the ransom theory of atonement. This is very interesting. This is an early teaching of the church, but it's not the only teaching of the church. And this one, you can see very specifically, as I said, it is fixed on the death of Jesus being a ransom for all the sins of the world, either to Satan or either to God the Father. You could go either way with this theory.
Did you say that one really took root in the 3rd century?
Yes.
So a few hundred years after Jesus died. So the
Yes.
earliest Jesus followers did not
No.
make sense of it this way.
No. This was an evolutionary theory. Mm-hmm. And then the third one is called the Christus Victor, okay? Christ the Victor, okay? The Christus Victor is the Latin for it. And the classical understanding of the Christus Victor theory of atonement is widely considered to be a dominant theory for most of the historic Christian church, and actually it still is today. And in this theory, Jesus Christ dies in order to defeat the powers of evil. And the powers of evil are sin, death, the devil, and hell. But also, we see this in defeating the evil empires, Rome, Babylon, all these things. And Jesus takes on these evil powers of both spiritual and temporal meaning in the earthly realm. And in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, this one particularly emphasizes Jesus' resurrection from the dead. In that life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the world has been set free from the bondage of the evil empires, right? And so this one has actually been a rather popular one, in that Christ is the victor over all the evil of the world. And I'm not just talking about evil like Satan, but I'm talking about people like Hitler and Pol Pot and Stalin and all these people.
But even the story that we get is Jesus died, and then he died on Good Friday, and then he's resurrected on Sunday. But there's Holy Saturday in there, where he goes to the depths of hell, is how the story goes, and he rescues people. So this idea that there's still this concept of hell. I mean, we could do a whole episode on hell and how that came about. That's all very complicated that we won't get into it right now. But we can't forget that part of the story, and I think that's rooted in this Christus Victor one.
Right, and one of the beauties of the Christus Victor theory of atonement is just that which Samantha said. On Holy Saturday, Christ, the risen Christ, goes and vindicates this abode of hell. He drags people out and he, quote, saves them.
And there's artwork that shows
Yeah.
this. There's a lot of artwork, I think from the Renaissance especially,
Yeah.
right? Is that the period?
Yeah.
Of Jesus pulling people out from hell, and they have chains around
Yeah,
them. and stuff.
some theologians for Christus Victor says in the Christus Victor theory, hell is no longer. It does not have power over us, right? The fourth one is the satisfactory theory, and this one comes much later. This one comes in the 12th century. It's from St. Anselm of Canterbury, and he proposed a satisfaction theory of atonement. And this theory states that Jesus Christ's death is understood as a death to satisfy the justice of God, that God is angry at humanity, and God needs to be justified. And so the satisfaction here means that once again there needs to be a payment back to God. And this is interesting because the ransom theory started with a payment to Satan, that Satan has control and it needs to be paid back, or it could be paid back to the Father. The ransom theory has both Satan and God the Father, where the satisfactory thing says, no, it needs to be paid back just to God, okay? So this idea that Jesus, as the one person, pays the payments of sin and evil back to God the Father because we're just disgusting human beings and God can't stand us. That's my particular interpretation of the satisfactory theory.
You're saying you believe that?
Oh no, I'm not saying I believe that. I'm saying that is
the theory.
that is
Right.
my understanding of that theory. That theory thinks that we're disgusting people and we need to be corrected. And I'll tell you at the end. The fifth one is it's called penal substitution theory. And penal substitution theory is it was developed in the Reformation, and many of the reformers, including Calvin and Luther, took St. Anselm's satisfactory theory and modified it slightly because they said that it needs to have more legal framework. It needs to be more rigid in its understanding of what the cross, only the cross, what the cross is satisfying. And the result in the penal substitutionary atonement theory is that Jesus dies to satisfy the wrath against human sin, right? Now, Calvin and Luther, during the Reformation and the Middle Ages, believed this, but most mainline liberal Protestants no longer believe in penal substitutionary atonement. That's not really a thing anymore. There's also one called governmental theory, and I'm not going to get into the weeds of this. This is kind of a variation on penal substitution, and it's most common among the Methodist tradition. And then the seventh one is the scapegoat theory, and this is the most modern. The scapegoat theory is a modern atonement theory rooted in kind of philosophical understandings and concepts of the scapegoat, which is its own thing, and that Jesus was a scapegoat. And something was put on Jesus. He became the scapegoat for all humanity, and he took on the sins of the world to pay for the evils. But he was the scapegoat. He kind of ran off. Something was put on him. He ran off. He died. And from that, we have been vindicated. There's 7 historic traditional ones. Some are good. Some, I think, are absolutely terrible and
Very
horrible.
harmful.
Horrible and terrible theology. And I will let you know, as both a Christian, practicing Christian, and an ordained pastor, I am firmly and supportively in the first one, which is the moral influence theory, that it's Jesus' life and teachings that are so radical in terms of love and grace, starting something new, that had brought him to be the first martyr. But from that, the story of Easter means that his teachings live on in the life of many Christians. And so I am firmly in the moral influence theory.
I would say me too.
And that's really all and I also like Christus Victor. I'm in favor of Christus Victor, but my first one is definite moral influence theory.
Christus Victor doesn't make sense to me, and we don't have to open up this conversation too much, but to say that Jesus won over sin while there's still sin, won over death while there's still death, like all of these things, and to say that, like, well, after him was the afterlife. There's a concept of the afterlife. So that one I just struggle with.
Sure,
like
sure. I get that.
If you really ground it, like, well, he didn't, but all these things still exist, so he didn't really... Yeah, I do think that Jesus of Nazareth and then Jesus the Christ, which was an identity that really took form after he died, like an understanding of that identity, changed the direction of human history. Actually, I don't think that can be argued. Of course, he changed the direction of humanity, of our species, in a very big way. In a beautiful way, also in a harmful way, the way some people took his teachings and twisted it, and colonization and all these things, right? So that was a lot of information.
Yeah.
So in conclusion, this is a good episode for Thanksgiving because it has a lot to do with Thanksgiving and sacrifice and all these things. But I want to say a couple things. So if you celebrate Thanksgiving and you're with your family, oftentimes adult children grow up and don't have the same views as their family.
Really? Fascinating.
If you're at the Thanksgiving table and your parents are there, so I hope these episodes are useful or interesting for a lot of reasons, but I especially hope to make the point over and over again that there has never been one version of Christianity, as these atonement theories show us, as like just understanding the word and concept of sacrifice, right? There's never been one understanding of what these things are, what the Jesus story is about. So if you have parents that you think differently of, give some, well, I'll get there. If you have parents who think differently than you, but also if you're an adult who has adult children, I know that my kids are young, but I believe that children are kind of born updated. So they're born to go beyond us. They are impacted by a different culture. Dylan and I have had a lot of conversations about the certain types of beliefs that we hope our children never grow up to have. But if they do, what we will do, and we will not condemn them. We're being very intentional about coming at it with curiosity and letting them tell us, because when adult parents push their own views and don't allow space for their children to have their views, it just pushes the children further into their views, and that could be a good thing. So give parents space to have theirs, but also expect them to give you space to have yours. So all that is to say that there has never been one version of Christianity. To this day, we are debating the meaning of the Jesus story. So if you are confused, welcome to Christianity. If you find yourself debating with people around the Thanksgiving table or anywhere in your life what all this means, welcome to Christianity. If you see it differently than your children or your parents or your grandparents or anybody else, welcome to Christianity. This is the path. This is the tradition. By digging deeper and debating all of it, we're actually carrying the tradition forward. This is Christianity. There's not one right version. There are some versions that are harmful, and we should call them out for sure. We can say that there are some versions that are for sure wrong. Like, no, that's definitely not what's going on here. However, there's a lot of possibilities of what could be right. So I hope these episodes make that point, that there has never been, and there currently is not, one version or expression or understanding of Christianity. So welcome to Christianity. Unpacking all of it and figuring it out and figuring out what's useful for us and not useful for us. That's the path. That's the tradition. So welcome.
Samantha and I have two daughters, as we say, as we tell you. One is going to be, she's 3, but she's going to be 4 next month in December, and our other daughter, our youngest daughter, is 2. And I think about Thanksgiving, and I think about all the wonderful things that God has given us, and I give thanks for our daughters. I also give thanks for Samantha, and for our whole family. But I think about it. I think about the Thanksgiving table. And I think that in time, I hope that our table, that our dinner table, that our Thanksgiving table, our Christmas table will always be a place that we can gather around food and conversation. And, some people like black tavern ham, and some people like honey ham, and some people like baked ham, and some people like deep fried turkey, and some people like roasted turkey, and some people like smoked turkey. And yet all of those things are all a part of the meal. And so sometimes bringing our differences around the table and hearing each other and listening to each other can be a really beautiful thing, especially in this season of harvest, in the season of Thanksgiving. So I really hope that our daughters and our family will always have an opened table where we can have conversation and food. And if you find yourself around Thanksgiving and you just have to remove yourself from the table because someone's really, really upsetting you, that's okay too. And so I hope that this episode on sacrifice and offering and all kinds of other things will be helpful to you.
Yeah. I think embracing all of the offerings that somebody has to make in their belief is important. Also, equally as important, if you know who Elizabeth Gilbert is, I follow her and listen to all of her stuff. She recently said, you're allowed to leave. You're allowed to leave. If somebody is treating you unwell, if somebody is thinking that their version, like with our context, what we're talking about, their version of Christianity is the only. And listen, we are saying this with humility because Dylan and I have been those people. We have strong beliefs and we have been the people calling out others. And it's a constant path towards not being that way. And there is a time to be tolerant and inclusive, and there's a time to call out views. And I think the spiritual path and the psychological well-being path is to always be teetering on that line and figure out when you should sit at the table and listen to people and accept, and when to not fight. But again, if you go back to that turn the other cheek episode, when to, as Liz Gilbert has said, you're a grown-up. No one has a gun to your head. You are allowed to get up and say, I'm done here, and leave. You are allowed to do that. It is a brave choice. It is a difficult choice, but you are allowed to do that. If it is unwell, if it's not healthy for you, you are allowed to say, I do not want to be here.
Yeah.
I love you, and I am leaving. So sacrifice.
Yeah, and Thanksgiving, sacrifice, and Christianity has always had this multitude of different understandings, and yet it's all kind of under this one umbrella. And we can say this, though, I think if Samantha would agree with me, Jesus' life and Jesus' teachings are not about keeping people in fear. So if you're in fear of people who are around you and they're making you feel icky and disgusting and judging you, that's not the way of Jesus. And so, yes, please get yourself up from the table and go be somewhere safe.
Yes. You don't...
Jesus' message and teachings are about liberation and freedom and new life. And
the people who love you, chances are, if you're sitting at their Thanksgiving table or if they're sitting at yours, it's because you have some kind of intimate relationship with them. You're related, you're good friends. They know what you think. They know. You don't have to over-explain yourself. They know. Just like Dylan and I know what people in our lives think, and they know what we think. We don't have to explain ourselves if the time comes where it's not. Now, Dylan and I are lucky. We don't have people in our family who we want to write off, and we don't have that situation. Not to say we don't have disagreements, but we don't need to say, I'm done here. However, if that is for you, that's all right. That's okay. You can leave. If you feel unsafe, if you feel like they are continuing to try to push you in another direction, that's okay. All right. Happy Thanksgiving, y'all.
Happy Thanksgiving. Have a wonderful holiday.